grew up in, it's no longer. It's not the classroom that that your sons and daughters are in, okay? The way they're learning math is completely different. It truly is a different place. Like, I mean, I think back to when I was in third grade, and when I was in third grade, my job was to multiply. That's all I had to do, multiply all day long. That's all I did. Fourth grade, I had to divide, but I had so much drill and practice with multiplication in third grade that by the time I got to fourth grade, I was really good at division because I had already had that. Well, now, and I'm noticing this more and more, I previously taught high school, and I'm watching high school topics that are being pushed further down in the curriculum through this Common Core. But I have to tell you, your children, they rise to the occasion. It's impressive the way they can, what they can do. But again, there's more on the plate, and that's what was happening is they kept pushing down this content, and there became more and more on the plate. And then what happens in third grade and fourth grade? Well, if you're pushing more on their plate, well, then we're taking some of that off. And some of you notice that your children, their multiplication and division skills maybe aren't there the way they were for you, the way you had to know them. Well, it's not their fault. It was that too much was being put on the plate. And that's really what came about with Common Core. They were realizing we can't do this to them. I've seen 6th, 7th grade, 8th grade books with 13 and 14 chapters in them, okay? It's a lot of chapters with a lot of content, each one maybe 10 sections, okay? It's too much content. Common Core came in and said, we don't need to do this. I had heard about a study where they started teaching elementary school kids Spanish. And the amount of content, they're taking time out of the week to teach little kids Spanish, and they said that the amount of content that you teach a little child, grades K to 5, in Spanish, could be learned in 1 week in high school. So why are we taking all this time out to do something? It's not necessary sometimes. So what's happening is now they're saying the same thing. Originally, the idea was expose them to everything every year. Expose them to every topic in mathematics, all the different levels, obviously age appropriate. And then they'll get the exposure and then they'll understand it. Well, no, we're just skimming the surface and they're not understanding anything because we're skimming over things. Common Core came in and said, you know what, this is what we need to do. We need to kind of remove that and give a little bit extra time to study these things so they understand it a little bit better. Okay, so that's what we're kind of going to go through here. And most importantly to me, I think you kind of want to hear like how it's affecting your students and how they're learning and how it's a little bit different. So we'll kind of get to the important stuff here. The academic standards, again, this is like what Dr. Cullis was saying about upon the completion of grades K through 12, what's to be expected of them and what they're going to need in the workplace, in you know, the changing society. The domains, this right here is really important. We'll go through each one. Counting and cardinality. Cardinality is just a fancy word for grouping numbers and understanding where numbers belong in the big picture. And I remember as a kid, I'd see directions and it would say, okay, choose the integer that best fits the question. And I would see the word integer, I'd be like, what does that mean? I'd go to the question and I'd just be like, oh, I can answer this. And I'd be like, forget that. I don't even know what that word means. I don't even want to worry about it. And you would just kind of brush over things because you just didn't know. And now we have time to say, no, we're not just going to brush over that. Let's talk about this and let's understand what the set of integers are. And we started talking about that and understanding that numbers belong to groups. Natural numbers, whole numbers, integers, rational, irrational. And some of you are sitting there going, I have no idea what any of those things are. Well, your kids do. We talked about it today, okay? And those are things that we really want to emphasize and make sure that they're not just skimming over that vocabulary. We take the time now to not just graze over it and just answer the question because it's not about the answer to that question. It's about that journey of getting there, right? So that's the counting and cardinality domain. The next one is operations and algebraic thinking. The biggest part there for me is the algebraic thinking. Operations we learn and we kind of drill and practice those the same old-fashioned way. We need that. But it's that algebraic thinking and the thinking part for me, even more than the algebra. I tend to notice this. You know, these children are different than us. They're in this world of instant gratification. Everything they do is instant. They want a song, they download it. They don't know what it's like to wait by the radio trying to press the record button and get that song on the radio on your mixtape. They have no idea what that patience and dedication is. Everything's instant, okay? So when it comes to thinking, I tell them they pounce on things. They pounce. They attack their prey. I said, take your time, stalk your prey. Look at the numbers. Think about them. Wrap your mind around them a little bit before you kind of just jump all over it. Because sometimes there's an easier way. Sometimes they pounce so quickly and then we stop and we think about it and they're like, oh, duh. Like all these multiple choice answers, none of them even make sense. So there's only one of them that's even reasonable if they had stalked their prey. They could have saved themselves all this number crunching if they just thought about it a little bit first. So that's that thinking component. We have time for that now. Now there's time to slow down and not just attack all these problems. The next piece is number operations, and you'll see it's both base 10 and fractions. And I'm not proud to admit this because obviously I'm an educator and I think I'm responsible for making sure that my students know this. But I was working with 8th graders today. We were doing a project with grid paper and rolling dice and all. We had to do measurements with protractors and rulers. And I would say about 80% of my 8th graders do not know how to read a ruler. 80%, okay? They are under the impression that with our customary system of inches, that if they're going 2 inches and then they go all the way to the end, but they don't quite reach 3, they're 1 tick mark away from 3. That means it's 2.9. 2.9 inches. And some of you are going, isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? No, well, you know, this is where we need to kind of get into that and make them dissect and understand why. Which is why I tell them the metric system is so much better. The metric system is base 10, just like our decimals. But the American Standard System, everything is a different number. There's 12 inches in a foot, there's 3 feet in a yard, there's 5,280 feet in a mile. You have all these numbers to remember, and for them, when we're looking at an inch, they don't realize that that's not broken into 10, just like a centimeter. Depending on each ruler, one's in 16ths, one's in 8ths, one's in quarters, and we have to take the time to let a kid get their hands on a ruler. Let a kid actually start measuring things and making things with that ruler so that they can see. Common Core is allowing for that. We now have time for them to sit down. So we were doing a project activity on similar figures with my 8th graders, and this is when I kind of came to the conclusion they don't know how to use a ruler. Some of my kids got the point of the project, the similar figures. Some of my kids today learned how to use a ruler, and that to me is a success. Even if they didn't quite get to that place where we were learning the similarity of triangles, at least they learned how to use a ruler, and at least I had time to teach them that. Where in the past, when we had 15 chapters in a book, it was like, just measure in centimeters. We don't have time for these fractions. Let's just measure in centimeters because we don't really have the time to sit down and explain to you, well, fractions aren't cut the same way, and they're cut into different sort of pieces, and you have to read that ruler and examine things a little bit deeper. Measurement and data, same thing. It's the precision of using these things. On a protractor, you get 2 sets of measurements, one on the inside and one on the outside. And when you look at those 2 measurements, you don't just take an angle and just look at it, see where it goes like a ruler, and pick the number. You actually have to make an educated decision. Which number is it? Is it 70 degrees or 110 degrees? Well, if it looks like this, you better not tell me it's 110, because that's our acute angle. And now, again, it's thinking. It's putting that thought process in. Common Core allows for that. It gives us time in our classrooms. We eliminate certain topics so we can spend more time getting deeper understanding. Okay? And then geometry, same thing. It's polygons, it's circles, it's area, perimeter. And that's another one where area and perimeter tends to be a big one where when we talk about the units, I have time to actually explain to somebody why area is square units and volume is cubic inches, and why when we measure the perimeter of a room, it's just inches or feet or whatever it might be. We don't have time for that usually. And we have kids memorizing. If you're doing perimeter, it's inches. If you're doing area, it's inches squared. And if you're doing volume, it's inches cubed. And if I was a kid, I'd be like, but why? Tell me why. And now, again, like I said, we have the time to be able to do that. So Common Core has made that better. And you'll see here, it's greater focus on fewer topics. So that when a kid asks me, wait a minute, is that inches or inches squared? Well, I actually show them. And in fact, this paper right here is perfect for this because each box here is 1 inch squared. And we get to talk about it. Look, I'm putting my hands. This is 1 inch squared. It's not some abstract concept. There it is. I could cut it out and hold 1 inch squared in my hand. We talk about the tiles on the floor in the school, how each one is 1 square foot, 12 inches by 12 inches. Because then they understand the concept of area, length times width. Well, 1 inch times 1 inch. Well, 1 times 1, that's 1, and inch times inch is inches to the second power, repeated multiplication. And wow, we can connect that even to exponents. Oh my God, we can talk about exponents and measurement and put it all together because we've got all this time to talk about it. I don't know that was done in the past. I'm in education about 13 years now, and I feel like it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. We just kind of grazed over things even 10 years ago. So we're moving to good places. Coherence is, again, linking them so that when I learn it in one grade, I can take it and build upon it for the next. And then the last is the rigor, digging deeper and kind of getting that conceptual understanding, because that's really what it is. If they can wrap their mind around it, then they can later apply it and go, wait, I can take this and apply it to something else that I already know. And they go in and attack a problem with reasoning as opposed to just this robotic sort of, my teacher told me these skills, my teacher told me a song, and this is how I know how to do it. I hate songs. The kids know the lyrics, but they don't know the meaning of them. They sing songs to me all the time, and then they screw up the words, and it's really something where a song is great as a mnemonic, but do they understand what they're saying? Most of the time they don't. I see it. I see it going on.
Hopefully not.
And for some it works because that's the way they learn, and I wouldn't downplay those mnemonics. Sometimes a kid needs that just to kind of reinforce it so they can remember, but that's where we are. So again, this is what Dr. Cullis had talked about college and career and just going through those, what they need to be ready for. And I think that's in one of your packets as well, so I'm going to keep going because to me it's the examples in the classroom and things that you'd like to see, like, well, what are you taking time on? Okay, so for instance, something like this, and I'm going to do a different example than I did in the last one. Let's say if I'm saying to if I ask my kids in class, I'll say to them, okay, well, what is 6 divided by 2, and what is 6 divided by 1/2? Okay? If I give them those two questions, they tell me both of the answers are 3. And that's a problem, okay? Because they see those and they're just seeing that 2, they're not thinking about the numbers. Again, they're pouncing on it. They're not stalking their prey and really thinking about what it means. And if we think about what it means to divide something, if we're taking 6 and we're dividing it by 2, well, there's 2 ways we can think about it. That means dividing it into 2 equal groups, or groups of 2. So I want you to think of this as groups of 2. Well, then I'm saying, okay, if I'm taking 6 and I want to break it up into groups of 2, well, then how many groups of 2 will I have? Well, we know that that's going to give me 3. Well, then when we're dealing with this, then I'm taking 6 and I'm dividing it into groups of how much? Oh, 1/2. Well, that's a little bit weird to think about. So what we do is we take, and I tell them we have candy bars. And I'll take something like this and I'll say, okay, well, here are 6 candy bars. And we'll say, okay, well, we're dividing them into groups of 1/2. We're not taking them into groups of 2, and I would have them circle 2s, and they would see that there are 3 groups of 2. Well, now I'm circling groups of 1/2. So I say, well, how are we going to do this? The kids say, well, you got to cut up the candy bars. Of course we do. So then we cut up our candy bars, and we cut them into halves. So now we've got a bunch of halves. And then I have them come up and circle groups of 1/2. So when I pass the marker, every kid wants to come up and circle. So one comes up and circles this one. The next kid comes up and circles this one. There's a group of 1/2. And here's another group of 1/2 and 1/2 and 1/2. And we keep doing this all the way until they realize that how many groups of 1/2 do I have? 12 of them, right? And now we have some understanding rather than me singing that song. How dividing fractions is easy as pie. You flip the second and multiply. Well, sure, if you're a robot and you don't care why. And if you can remember the words to that song and you can remember that skill. But most don't remember it. They might remember the song, but then they can't apply it. And to me, I'd much rather them understand what we're doing when we divide. Understand the concept there, and if you understand the concept, you're more likely to hold on to it and be able to apply it. I mean, your kids were doing, okay, this was an easy one. They were doing things like this. They were doing like 12 divided by 2/3. And they're drawing their candy bars, and it takes them time to draw these things. But we have the time to do that, and that's what's good because they're getting their hands on it. And they're saying, okay, well then they take each of their 12, and now we're saying, okay, well if this is 12, now I'm dividing it into groups of 2/3. Well then we talk about this, and we say, well then, what are we doing here? How do we do this? Wait, you have to cut them into thirds now. Oh, so every candy bar gets cut into thirds, and now the groups, now when they come up, every kid is circling 2/3. And then they find out, of their 12 candy bars, how many groups of 2/3. And they realize that in the second way, I've run out of thirds in this one, so now maybe I have to circle 2 like this. But that's okay, I can take part of this one and put it with that one, and I get another 2/3. And here's another 2/3, right? And as we kind of see as we go through this, well, this is just 2, so it would be 6 times this amount, right? Because these are 2 out of my 12 candy bars, if you're with me. Are you with me? Okay. So we got 2 of them there. We would end up multiplying this by 6. So you can see here, this is going to get me 18. I'm going to get 18 groups of 2/3. Okay, well, sure, I could use my limerick, flip the second and multiply. 3 over 2, put this over here. And I could say, okay, well, that's going to be 36 over 2. And 36 over 2 is going to give me 18. Well, there's no understanding. It's just robotic if I flip the second and multiply. I don't understand why it's 18. I'm just doing what you told me to do. And that's a lot. And your kids are good listeners. They do follow directions when we tell them to do things. But I would much rather they know why they're doing it. Don't just do it because I told you to do it. Understand why. So that's, to me, the biggest part that I'm loving about Common Core is because otherwise they don't hold on to information. And nobody does. If you don't have a reason to hold on to it and it doesn't make sense to you, what good is it? So Common Core is allowing us to take the time and let your kids sit down and draw, color things in, circle things. And I'm enjoying that because, I mean, I'm a math person. And I want them to understand it. I don't want them to be little robots regurgitating information to me. I think that's the most important. Are we?
Yeah, it's about time. But how many people have like students in K2? Any K2s in here? Okay, if you notice, you probably recognize this model coming home on their homework list. This is the bar model, and this is where it starts, because now they're starting to understand what a number is, starting all the way back in kindergarten, and you can see where it applies. Every year they're building on this, getting a visual representation into their mind and understanding, really comprehending what that number is, and how it will be much easier for them to understand when they get to 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and they're having to do fractions and decimals and all of these things. It really does build that foundation. So my youngest son is in 2nd grade. He's only been in Common Core, so he's a product of the Common Core. And it's such a different experience listening to him, because when he explains it, he always says, I know the answer, and then he always goes, because, and he tells me the answer. Where my 6th grader, he knows all those rules and he can just whip it out, but he doesn't necessarily know why. So it's fun to watch how different it is. When I walk in even in our kindergarten classrooms, and the kids they always know at the end of it, they say, I know that 2 + 8 is 10 because, and then they'll tell us how they got that. So it's really fascinating to see how our younger ones are really carrying this through. And if you have anyone younger than 3rd grade, they only know Common Core because that's all they've had up to this point. If you have specific questions or questions about grade levels or anything about math, we're going to go back for questions. We'll be available to answer those. You have one more rotation. That's the blended, the science and social studies. This is our largest group, so it's going to be a little bit tight. We'll bring some chairs.